moment my son-in-law said those words, I felt something cold move through my chest. Not fear exactly, but the specific chill of realizing that someone you trusted had been planning something behind your back for a very long time. My name is Roy. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years running a small electrical contracting business in Dayton, Ohio. Nothing glamorous. Early mornings, late nights, sore hands, a truck that always needed something fixed. But I built it myself, and I was proud of that. When I retired 4 years ago, I sold the business and walked away with enough to live comfortably. Not rich, but steady. My wife Lorraine passed 8 years ago from a stroke. It was sudden. One morning she was making coffee and talking about painting the kitchen, and by the afternoon she was gone. After that it was just me and my daughter. My daughter. I need you to understand something about her before I tell you the rest of this story. She was the center of everything I did after her mother died. I put every bit of energy I had into making sure she was okay. When she met her husband at 32, I welcomed him. I helped them with the down payment on their house. I watched their kids on weekends so they could have time together. I showed up when the furnace broke, when the car needed work, when they needed someone to move furniture. I was there. Every single time. Her husband, I'll be honest, never felt quite right to me. He was polite in the way that some men are polite when they want something from you. Never rude. Never gave me a real reason to say anything. But there was always something behind his eyes when I talked about money, about the business, about what I had saved, a kind of attention that went a little too sharp. I ignored it for years. I told myself I was being an overprotective father. Last spring, my daughter called me on a Tuesday afternoon and said she had a surprise. She and her husband had bought me a 2-week river cruise through Europe, the Rhine and the Moselle, Germany, France, Switzerland. She said I'd been cooping myself up at home since the pandemic and I needed to get out, see something, live a little. She said she'd already paid for it, that it was a gift, and that I was leaving in 3 weeks. I was touched, genuinely. I cried a little after I hung up. I stood in my kitchen thinking about how lucky I was to have a daughter who thought of me like that. I started preparing, got a new pair of walking shoes, dug out my old travel bag from the hall closet, called my neighbor to ask if he'd check the mail. 3 days before I was supposed to leave, I went over to my daughter's house to drop off a key in case anything happened while I was gone. They weren't expecting me. I let myself in through the back. I had a key, always had a key, and I could hear them in the kitchen. Not fighting, not arguing, just talking in the low, flat way that people talk when they're discussing business. I almost called out to them. I was halfway through the laundry room when I heard my name. I stopped. I heard my son-in-law say something about the account. Then I heard my daughter say, by the time he gets back, it'll already be done. He won't be able to do anything about it. I stood very still. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a lawnmower started up somewhere down the street. And if he figures it out before he leaves, her husband said. He won't, she said. He trusts me completely. I walked back out through the laundry room. I sat in my truck in their driveway for about 4 minutes. Then I drove home. I didn't cry. I was past that somehow. What I felt was something quieter and more serious. Like the feeling you get when you realize a job is bigger than it looked and you need to think carefully before you touch anything. I didn't know exactly what they were planning, but I knew it involved money, and I knew it involved me being gone for 2 weeks, and I knew that my daughter believed I would never suspect her. I had to find out what was happening before I got on that boat. I called a man named Whitfield the next morning. He wasn't a private detective exactly, more of a financial investigator. I had used him once, years ago, when I thought an employee was skimming from the business. He was thorough, quiet, and he didn't ask unnecessary questions. I gave him what I knew, my accounts, my daughter's name, her husband's name, and what I had heard. I told him I needed answers as fast as possible. He said he'd get back to me within a week. 2 days later, he called. What he told me was this. My son-in-law had found an attorney who specialized in elder financial law, specifically in power of attorney documentation. Over the past several months, he had obtained a copy of a general power of attorney that I had signed years earlier when Lorraine was sick, before she passed. a document I had completely forgotten about. In the original form, it granted limited authority to Lorraine, but somehow, and Whitfield said he was still untangling exactly how, a version of that document had been altered, modified slightly. Enough to give my son-in-law certain signing authority over one of my brokerage accounts while I was traveling and unavailable. The plan, as best Whitfield could reconstruct it, while I was on the cruise, my son-in-law would use that document to initiate a transfer. Not everything, that would be too obvious. Just enough. A significant portion of my retirement savings moved into an account in his name, structured to look like a loan I had supposedly agreed to. By the time I returned, the paperwork would be filed, the transfer would be complete, and any legal challenge would take years. My daughter knew. That much was clear from what I had overheard. She wasn't a bystander. I sat with that for a long time. I called Whitfield again and asked him what my options were. He gave me 3. I could go to the police immediately. I could contact the brokerage directly and put a freeze on the account. Or I could let it play out and catch them in the act, which would make for a much stronger legal case. I chose a version of all 3. First, I called the brokerage and quietly moved the majority of the funds in that account into a new account that my son-in-law had no connection to, not under a name he knew, not linked to anything he could access. I left a small amount in the original account, enough to look untouched, but not enough to matter. Then I called a real estate attorney I had known for 20 years, a man named Garrison, and I told him everything. He set up a meeting with a financial crimes attorney for the following week. And then I got on the boat. I know that sounds strange, but I had a reason. If I confronted my daughter before I left, they would lawyer up immediately and destroy whatever evidence still existed. If I disappeared, went on the cruise, stayed quiet, let them believe everything was going according to plan, they would move forward. They would initiate the transfer. They would create a paper trail. And that paper trail would become the rope they hung themselves with. So I packed my bag and I went to the airport. I will say this. The first 2 days on that river were genuinely beautiful. I don't say that to be flip. There's something about moving slowly through a country you've never seen, watching the riverbank slide past, the old towns and the church steeples, that loosens something in your chest. I had forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere with no obligations and no one who needed something from me. On the second evening, I was sitting at a small table near the bar, nursing a beer I didn't really want, when an older gentleman sat down across from me and asked if the seat was taken. His name was Sullivan. He was 69, a retired civil engineer from Portland, Oregon, traveling alone because his wife had decided at the last minute that she got seasick, even on rivers, which he said she told him after they had already bought the tickets. He made me laugh. That was the first thing. Over the next several evenings, Sullivan and I fell into the easy rhythm that sometimes happens between 2 older men who have both been through enough that they don't need to perform anything for each other. We talked about our work, our wives, his still living, mine not, our kids. I told him a little of what was happening, not everything. Enough. He listened without drama. He didn't tell me what to do. He just said, "You know, the hardest part is realizing that the person you raised isn't who you thought they were. That doesn't mean you did something wrong. It means they made choices." That sat with me. On day 7, my phone showed a notification, a flagging alert from the brokerage. Exactly the kind I had asked them to set up. Someone had submitted documentation requesting a transfer from the original account. The transfer attempt had been blocked, of course. The funds were no longer there, but the attempt itself was now on record. I called Garrison from my cabin quietly while the boat was docked at a small town whose name I can't pronounce correctly even now. He had been waiting. He told me the documentation my son-in-law had submitted used the altered power of attorney, which meant we now had documented evidence of attempted financial fraud using a forged instrument. He had already spoken with the financial crimes attorney. There was enough to act. I asked Garrison to proceed. I finished the cruise. I ate good food and drank decent wine and walked through a vineyard in Alsace with Sullivan in his extremely practical rain jacket that he wore every single day regardless of the weather. On the last evening, we exchanged numbers and made a vague plan to meet in Chicago sometime. The kind of plan that older men make and sometimes actually keep. When the plane touched down in Dayton, I turned on my phone and I had 14 missed calls from my daughter. I didn't call her back. I drove home, unpacked my bag, fed the neighbor's cat that had somehow gotten into my kitchen, and went to bed. The next morning, I drove to the police station with Garrison. I want to be honest with you about something. Sitting in that station, giving a statement, saying my daughter's name out loud in that context. That was one of the hardest things I have done. Not as hard as losing Lorraine, but a different kind of hard, a specific grief that doesn't have a clean name. Because here's the thing no one tells you when something like this happens. The anger is easier than the sadness. The anger is clean. The sadness is the part that catches you at strange moments, standing in the cereal aisle, or hearing a song she used to like when she was small, and just drops you. My son-in-law was arrested 4 days later. The charge was elder financial abuse and fraud. My daughter was charged as a co-conspirator. Her attorney reached out almost immediately about a plea arrangement. I did not make that easy for them. I don't say that with pride exactly. But I had spent 67 years being a person who made things easy for the people around him, who showed up quietly and never asked for much back. And I was done with that particular version of myself. What I want to tell you, and this is the part I've thought about most since it all happened, is that the 2 weeks on that river probably saved me. Not because anything dramatic happened, not because I had some revelation at sunset, but because it gave me time, alone and away from all of it, to sit with what I was losing and to decide what I still wanted. I still wanted a life. That sounds simple, and it is simple. But it took the Rhine and the Mosel and a retired civil engineer from Portland named Sullivan to remind me of it. I speak to Sullivan about once a month now. He and his wife drove through Ohio last fall and we met for dinner. His wife, it turns out, does not get seasick at restaurants, which Sullivan says is very convenient. My grandchildren are with me every other weekend. My daughter's attorney worked out an arrangement that keeps me involved in their lives while the legal process continues. They're 7 and 10. They like board games and bad movies, and the specific kind of pancakes I make with blueberries and too much butter. They don't fully understand what's happening with their parents. I keep it that way. As for my son-in-law, I think about what he believed when he set all of this in motion. He believed I was old and trusting, and that I wouldn't see it coming. He believed that being my daughter's husband was enough to make me blind. He was wrong about all of it. I didn't survive 31 years of running a small business by being careless with what mattered. I didn't raise a daughter, bury a wife, and come out the other side by being someone who folds when things get hard. I'm 67 years old. I have a good truck, a house I own outright, grandchildren who like my pancakes, and a friend in Portland who calls me on the first Sunday of every month. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. I keep coming back to that moment in the laundry room, the refrigerator humming, the lawnmower down the street. My daughter's voice saying he trusts me completely, like that was the thing that made it safe to do. And she was right. I did trust her completely. That trust was the real target. Not the account, not the money, not the power of attorney. The trust. Because without it, none of the rest of it works. I've thought a lot about what I could have done differently. Whether I missed signs, whether I gave too much, too easily, for too long, I don't think the answer to that is useful anymore. What I know is this. There are consequences to the choices we make, and those consequences don't care whether the person making them is your child or a stranger. My son-in-law believed he was clever. My daughter believed that love was the same thing as blindness. They were both wrong, and the wrongness of it came back to them in the most direct way possible, through their own paperwork, their own transfer attempt, their own documented fraud. I didn't need to do anything dramatic. I just needed to stop being the person they assumed I was. That's the part I want to sit with. Because I think for a long time I had confused being a good father with being an easy one, with not asking hard questions, was letting things go because the alternative felt like conflict. I was decent in all the ways that are visible and a little careless in the ways that aren't, and that carelessness, that old document I forgot to revoke, that assumption that family meant safety, that's what they used. There's a kind of wisdom that only comes from being hurt by someone you trusted. Not bitterness, not suspicion toward everyone. Something more specific than that. A clearer eye. An understanding that decency has to be paired with attention, that being a good person doesn't mean being a naive one. Whitfield, when I first called him, said something I've thought about since. The people most likely to take advantage of you are the ones who know you well enough to know what you won't see coming. He was talking about financial fraud. But it's true about everything. What got me through it wasn't anger. Anger is easy and it burns out fast. What carried me was something quieter. The decision, made in my truck, in my daughter's driveway, to keep thinking clearly, to not react, to move slowly and carefully, and do it right. That took more out of me than I expected. There were moments on that river cruise, standing on the deck at dusk watching the water, where I had to remind myself to keep going, to not call her, to not give them the warning that would let them destroy what they'd already built. Sullivan helped with that. Not by doing anything in particular, just by being a decent man who made me laugh and didn't need anything from me. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes, just being around someone who treats you like a regular person, not a target, not a resource, just a guy on a boat watching the Rhine go by, is enough to remind you that you're still that too. I'm 67 years old. I handled it. And if you're sitting somewhere right now wondering whether you're too old, too tired, or too far along to protect yourself, you're not. The only thing that was ever standing between me and what I deserved was the decision to act like I deserved it.